Welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. I'm your host, Rick Gannotta, and we're committed to bringing you thought leaders in the field to discuss what's new and noteworthy in the health sector. This is the Healthcare Nation podcast. Welcome to the show. Rick Gannotta here, your host, and I'm here with our producer, Joe Woolworth. Joe, how are you doing in there?
I'm doing good. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Beautiful day out. So trying to wrap things up. And as we committed to our audience, our practice is going to be to do a postscript intermittently and punctuate some of the regular shows we have with an update in what's happening that hopefully we can cover here on a regular basis, specifically focused on what's new and noteworthy.
There's a lot going on in the news, specifically starting with the healthcare sector in the markets, the current state of private equity and venture capitalism investments in the healthcare sector. What's your take on where everything is right now?
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you, again, all opinions expressed on the show are just for informational purposes only. But to answer your question, Joe, on that, listen, I think the first quarter of 2023 showed up, I would say, a pullback in private equity investment in healthcare across the board. A lot of this, my opinion, is that it had to do with this post-COVID shakeout. If you take a look at it, the sector was flush with cash when you go back 5 years or so. A lot of money out there, and what I would say, less than realistic initiatives that folks were putting out there to the PE and VC world. But what we've seen now, I think, is more of a reflection in what's happening in real time. I would say the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the further complexity that created with respect to accessing capital and funding sources for smaller firms has kind of dampened things. So were two things that were top of mind for me with respect to this pullback or this blunting. But to get into, specifics, I would say that a lot had to do with this post-COVID, flush with cash, and now a recalibration of what is realistic and what's going to make sense out there versus what's not from an investment perspective.
Yeah, so kind of your take on what's the positives, what's the negatives?
Yeah, if you look at, I'll just say from a trend kind of perspective on the positive side, obviously continued interest, strong investment in, and this is my opinion, models of care specifically. I think when folks look at Medicare Advantage as kind of a future endpoint for Medicare, they know that that in order to make that work, they're going to have to look at leveraging technology because the numbers are dramatic when you look at the demographics associated with the baby boomer population and the demand for healthcare services and how that's going to be applied through Medicare. And that'll be, I think, again, Medicare Advantage. But artificial intelligence, I think its application, obviously, in healthcare, we talked about that before, how it's going to play out in platforms. I think we're already seeing that right now. I also think that we're going to see a lot on the backend operation side of things. So pre-authorization and making a better experience for consumers who have their hand on the lever of where they're going to get their patient care. So a lot of that happening across the board. I would also add that mental health. I think there's a lot of very promising work being done in the mental health field. It's back. This is one of the positive areas by venture and private equity, and we're seeing that a lot in the telehealth space, which is very, very promising.
Right.
On the cons, I would say this. I do think that there's a lot, the FTC looking at structuring, valuation dynamics, rules concerning, investment ownership and how that impacts patient welfare. We're seeing a lot of that. So in general, I would say there's a mix of positives and negatives. It's the market, of course, but I do think in general, new models of care that address everything from workforce shortages, particularly the clinical shortages, the impact of Medicare Advantage, all highlight the potential area, I think, where we're going to have investment to be able to meet that demand. And it's going to depend upon technological innovation, I think, to make that happen. But again, there are regulatory considerations that we have to be wary of.
So switching gears to the debt ceiling, which, is what everybody's talking about in the traditional news cycle. But let's talk about a little bit the perception of how the debt ceiling debates are more about politics than economics, and how these political dynamics between the Democrats and the Republicans are impacting the health sector, specifically in light of the looming debt ceiling crisis.
Yeah, look, it's a real thing, and you hate to see partisan politics start to impact healthcare delivery. There's no doubt about that. But political dynamics have always had an influence in the healthcare sector across the board, whether it's on the med tech delivery side, supply chain, to reimbursement on the provider side, and everything that goes along with it. But in general, I would say this: yes, obviously significant impact. I think the bottom line is anything that creates uncertainty could lead to a disruption, right? And we're seeing that right now. Although I don't think it's impacting care delivery or will impact care delivery, I do think it impacts the strategic side of things. So folks who are thinking about planning or capital investments, and we just talked about private equity and venture capital, I think it has an impact in that space specifically because what the sector needs at the end of the day is stability and predictability to function effectively. And anything that throws that sideways is going to have an impact. So that's what we're seeing right now.
So we know that the public insurance programs like Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, Veterans Administration, and Department of Defense programs accounted for 42.5% of national health expenditures in 2021. So how do you feel like in the event of a debt ceiling breach, if that were to happen, how might that figure change? And what are the broader implications that this could have on the entire healthcare sector?
Yeah, I'll start with the second part. Look, I mean, the broader implications, you could take it to draconian levels and say, hospitals and clinics that rely on reimbursements could face significant financial strain. No doubt about that. Would that lead to closures or reductions in services? I don't think so, but that's always a possibility. When you think about the percentage, yes, I do think if the debt ceiling was breached, we might see a reduction in the percentage. I think it would be, if anything, a temporary reduction, because don't forget, when you look at the voting impact and who votes, and when you look at Medicare and Medicaid and the VA, there's a big influence on voters and their utilization of those services, who votes. And I think the older population will vote in favor of them making sure everything stays solvent. But that has nothing to do with the debt ceiling crisis as we see it right now. But I do think, again, to answer your question, I don't think it's going to impact direct care, but we might see a temporary reduction in the percentage. But the bottom line, as I said earlier, anything that creates instability is not good for the market.
Yeah. Next up, can you briefly explain, let's talk about the Affordable Care Act, the ACA stay. Can you briefly explain the recent federal appeals panel decision to pause the lower court decision regarding preventative care under the ACA?
Yeah, what this means at the end of the day is the existing Affordable Care Act rules, which require insurance companies to cover preventative care services. So this is cancer screenings, this is physicals, this is also certain drugs, that these will remain in effect while this legal battle over requirements is ongoing. Now, this is definitely seen as a positive, and I'll stop short of saying a victory for patient groups and others who are lobbying, right, that even small changes will require folks to go into their pockets for co-pays and out-of-pocket charges for these services. So this could be very expensive, right, particularly for individuals who are economically challenged. But the bottom line is, for clinical care, it could lead to folks not getting preventative care. And at the end of the day, they could get sick and then require more expensive treatments down the line. So it's an important issue.
So what could happen if the lower court ruling was ultimately upheld?
Well, if it's upheld, just as I said, out-of-pocket charges for preventative care services would be in effect, right? They wouldn't be covered anymore. So you'd have to pay for your physical, you'd have to pay for your cancer screenings and anything that was previously covered in the ACA preventative care scope. Now, I would say this: many insurers have pledged that they would maintain that preventative care, offering at no cost. But as we know, insurance premiums go up and things do change. So we'll have to see what happens, and I think it's all really hinging upon this future court ruling.
So let's talk about health panel markup. What's the reason behind this intense backlash from hospital groups concerning the site-neutral visits?
Okay. So look, the impact on hospitals, first of all, with site-neutral payments is this. At the end of the day, hospital outpatient clinics, right, are basically part of a hospital's infrastructure. And hospital infrastructures are very expensive. And if they were leveled from a reimbursement perspective to the same rate of reimbursement that, say, an outpatient clinic that is a physician run or a physician office, it would really be an inequitable, calculus, right? Because of the hospital infrastructure, power plant, et cetera, including cost of employees and everything that goes into maintaining a hospital platform. So this is led to intense, I would say, lobbying efforts from a lot of hospital groups, the American Hospital Association and others, who want to sway public opinion against this site-neutral proposal. And you can understand it, Joe, at the end of the day. If you and I were private practitioners in a freestanding clinic, yes, it's not easy today to cover, the expense associated with running a practice. But compare that to running a hospital outpatient department and clinic, where you have the cost of labor, the cost of infrastructure, everything, the direct and indirect costs. They're not the same. And I'm certainly not arguing one way or the other, but I think what there has to be is recognition so that reimbursement is fair for both parties, so that that independent private practitioner or group that's out there having a hard time getting reimbursement just in today's world of CMS has a chance to compete, and that we also at the same time recognize that hospital structures, platforms, et cetera, are much different when it comes to a cost profile than provider groups that perhaps are independent.
Right. So, all right, on a topic that seems to always be very popular with our audience, AI in healthcare, what are the early stage initiatives that are going on right now that are gaining momentum in Washington? And how do you think that they might shape the AI policy in healthcare?
Yeah, listen, before I answer that, we had Dr. Michael Ivan on a previous show from University of Miami, Department of Neurosurgery, fantastic episode, and I encourage folks to listen to that. And when you listen to how he described the future of neurosurgery, I don't think there was any aspect of it that didn't in some way incorporate technology, more specifically artificial intelligence. So I'm saying that because the most intense, high fidelity areas of surgery, and I'm using neurosurgery as an example, is going to get better because of AI. So when we think about, AI initiatives gaining momentum and how they're going to be regulated, we've all got to keep our eye on this, because if you're running a high performing health system, or if you're a physician, surgeon out there and you're going to leverage this, you want to, number one, understand what the guardrails are with respect to regulation. You also want to make sure that it fits into your strategy for competitive advantage, and you want to budget for it. And you can't do any of that unless you know where really the regulators and policy is going. So to answer the question specifically, there's, I think, 2 or 3 specific initiatives that right now are gaining momentum in DC. The first is the blueprint for a healthcare AI Bill of Rights, and that's coming out of the executive branch. The second is commerce, and they're, I think, now requesting comments out there from the general public for an AI accountability policy that's put out there. And then the last one is National Coordinator's Office. It's HTI-1, and that's a new proposed rule. And together, I would say the efforts represent, or maybe more specifically, they're really signaling that there's going to be an upcoming regulatory framework for folks to work within as artificial intelligence and machine learning is deployed in healthcare. And what I want to say to our audience is get involved. You want to make sure that decision making is not necessarily all done out of one of these 3 offices or departments, and that the content experts who are working with this, that their voice is represented in those conversations. So when there's opportunities to have your comments put into the federal record, like what we're doing in commerce is accountability request, you should do it.
Do you have a sense that they're, from a patient's perspective, not maybe from a hospital or a lobby perspective, that people have a discomfort with the use of AI?
Well, that's a great question. That really is. I think that when it comes to the patient-clinician compact, and I've said this all along, that level of trust, and that trust goes into a relationship. You cannot have that with an avatar. Let's just start with that as an example. But you and I spoke about this before. We also know that when you leverage artificial intelligence to augment a physician or clinician's, workflow, that you have better patient experiences with that. Why? Because it could free up that clinician so they have more time with the patient, or create a more efficient workflow for them so that they could, get to more immediate and, let's just say, even in some cases, life-saving tasks. So leveraging it the right way and making sure that the consumer and the patient understand that it's an augmented tool, but it's not in any way replacing or usurping, your provider or that relationship is important. That's really on us to do, right? There's no doubt about that. So when we think about organizations in general and regulatory frameworks that are moving forward, will it impact that? I think it will. They may move more towards the conservative side and perhaps kind of dial back on how far we see AI being deployed in clinical settings. But that remains to be seen. But I would argue this, and I'm sure you and I, again, have talked about this before and have both commented on it. I'm sure that folks are already using ChatGPT, to do a lot of different things. And why would that stop with, say, crafting a letter?
I feel like it's an interesting thing about ChatGPT in particular. It's almost like people don't want to admit that they're using it because everybody is afraid that people, I don't know what they're afraid of. Perhaps they're afraid that you shouldn't trust the results. Perhaps they're afraid of people think that they're slacking off and not doing their work because they're having a computer do their work, or I don't know what it is, but it seems like in my field, in marketing, there's a lot of hiding the fact that ChatGPT use is going on, or like, oh, don't tell them because that'll make them uncomfortable. And I've even seen when people do find out that ChatGPT is being used, that it's like, oh, don't do that. I'm uncomfortable with that.
Yeah.
I don't like, and I don't know if we've seen too many movies.
Yeah.
Or if regulation is going to fix it for anybody. Like, I know that there was an article that came out, the founder of OpenAI is asking for government regulation. So what does that mean to have somebody who runs a company asking for government regulation?
Yeah, great points across the board. One of the big concerns, certainly in healthcare and healthcare delivery, is bias, right? So whoever's, in the input and the output are so connected. So if there's any intrinsic bias in any answer, and if you're relying on that answer to be accurate and a source of truth that would say, let's just say, guide clinical care, look, it's a loaded proposition. Yeah. So I think when you think about applying regulation, that makes sense, right? To make sure that you're addressing the issue with bias across the board, and let's just say, utilizing and leveraging in a healthcare scenario the latest with respect to evidence-based care. So that's an example. Now, I think another piece, though, and it gets to one of the things you're saying, is just trust. And I think a lot of folks don't trust it because of the bias, but they're also thinking about a work product. Did you take the time to do this, or are you taking a shortcut? Yeah. And on the issue of disclosure, I think a lot of folks probably don't want to admit that they're using it or leveraging it or augmenting what they're doing with, say, a ChatGPT, right, because they don't want to look like they're not smart enough and that they're using this tool. Now, my answer to that is, I'll use a clinical example. Before there were stethoscopes, if folks were listening with a little, rolled up cone to a person's chest, and now we have ultrasound and we get our imaging capabilities. So again, using technology to augment already, established baseline of content expertise is good for everyone. And I also think that this is true even in the educational world. We should, instead of discouraging, the use of GPT or anything with respect to AI. We should be putting guardrails around when students should submit something where they use it, when they shouldn't, and actually challenge them with utilizing it, because they're going to be doing it in the future. And that goes with medical education, clinical education, nursing, so forth. And I just think in general, because it's invaded our life. So let's make sure we use it as a tool that augments what we're doing versus, totally co-ops things.
Yeah. And I guess if you guys have any questions in the audience that you'd love to hear on the next Postscript, go check out healthcarenationpodcast.com. Submit your question there, and we'll get to them.
That's great. Joe, have a great day.
You too.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests are for informational purposes only and not associated with any companies or academic institutions. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts, as well as our YouTube channel, Healthcare Nation Podcast. And if you have any questions or want to contact us, please reach out to healthcarenationpodcast.com.